Hey, good evening. This week I used the ProQuest historical newspaper database to research the Compromise of 1877. This compromise would be seen in a survey level class as a very pivotal moment in the late 1800s for the United States, as it brought the South out of Reconstruction under some kind of hazy circumstances, whereas a Democratic presidential nominee won the popular vote by almost 250,000 votes over the Republican candidate, but ultimately was not selected as the president. So for the four articles I chose, two from the New York Times and two from the Baltimore Sun. One from the New York Times comes just 2 days following the election, and it's titled "The Battle Won." And overwhelmingly, it writes that Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, had won outright. He had won all four of the disputed states, which later were declared to be Oregon, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. And so this was only 2 days following the election occurring, and that would be pretty quick for all those votes to be hand tallied and for him to be declared the winner. But just a little further south, the next day, the Baltimore Sun wrote almost the exact opposite of what the Times had written, saying that three of those states, the three southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, had all gone for the Democrats, and it conceded that Oregon had gone to the Republican column. It is interesting to point out that in the Baltimore Sun article, it reports that Wade Hampton won the South Carolina gubernatorial election by between 1,700 and 1,800 votes. But then when you look at the election of the president that year for South Carolina, the Republican won by 889 votes. Same thing with the Florida results. The Sun reported that the Democrats had a majority of between 1,000 and 1,500, but then when you look at the official election results for the presidency that year in Florida, the Republican won by 922 votes. Another pretty astounding figure for Louisiana was that the Sun reported that the Democrats had a majority of 10,000 votes, whereas when it really came down to it and you look at the presidential tallies, Louisiana went to the Republican column. About a month and a half later, in January 1877, the Baltimore Sun had an article that recounted the electoral commission that had been appointed or selected by the Congress that year in order to actually sift out these results. Those four states were still disputed, and it was kind of unclear how this was going to be resolved. Some hinted that the House would have to decide, but because the four states were all turning in two returns, basically, one set from the Democratic Party leaders, one set from the Republican Party leaders, Congress actually passed the Electoral Commission Act, where it established a 15-member panel to decide which returns they would accept. This panel had 5 members from the Senate, 5 from the House, and 5 from the Supreme Court. And that article detailed how they were selected by a vote in each house. The fourth article actually comes a year after the election occurred in February of 1878, and it's an interview entitled "The Electoral Bargain" with House member Charles Foster, who was a Republican from Ohio, who was an associate of Hayes. And in this, he claims that there was no deal whatsoever made between Republicans and Democrats, Northerners and Southerners, in how to ultimately give the election to Rutherford B. Hayes. He claimed that Southerners did not like Tilden, the Democrat, but they had, quote, a high appreciation of Mr. Hayes as the Republican. So these are just some pretty interesting articles to take a look at, and get into the details of the Compromise of 1877.